are also in their interest, and they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read three short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. This is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty, and Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy, to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the world." Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And you know, it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control, and in any event has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop, it's a red line, stop. And then, not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.
It's so
good to hear some wisdom coming from Europe, because unfortunately the dominant discourse in Europe is like the dominant discourse in the United States these days, which is war all the time. And I've always counted on Europe to be smarter than the US on these matters, because the US makes so many of these awful, unnecessary wars. And I've been surprised and very alarmed and disappointed by the European leaders falling into line with the US military-industrial complex. And Claire, thank you. It's just so good to hear your wonderful remarks. It's gotten very bad in Europe, as it has in the United States. Very hard to reach the mainstream because the media, the corporate media, have completely blocked out any honest accounting of how we got into the Ukraine war and what's happening and why it's a disaster. So it's very hard to even share basic facts right now. I know I was pretty frequently on just normal mainstream TV, but not these days, not in the last couple of years, because nobody wants to hear. And I begged the New York Times even for one editorial to tell the truth about this war, and I kind of badgered them into accepting something, and they accepted it, they edited it, they were getting ready to print it. And then they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Professor Sachs, we're not going to run it after all." So the fact of the matter is the corporate mainstream media is just completely saturated with the US government propaganda. So with that backdrop, here we are sharing some truth and sharing some thoughts together. I go back more than 30 years in Russia, Ukraine, US, European issues, because more than 30 years ago, I was trying to help President Gorbachev, and then trying to help President Yeltsin, and then trying to help President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, to overcome all of the huge difficulties that attended the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed because it was a miserable system. It didn't work. And Gorbachev knew it, and he wanted a normal society with normal relations with the US, and he wanted a common European home, and I loved the man for it. And when he asked me to be on his advisory team, of course, I said yes. And I learned that the United States could not take yes for an answer. It could not accept the idea of just a normal, cooperative relationship with a reformed Soviet Union or with an independent Russia. The US wanted unipolarity. The US wanted dominance. The US wants its way on everything. It's crazy. We're 4.2% of the world. We don't and can't and shouldn't aspire to run the world. We should aspire to cooperate. Well, I saw firsthand in a very painful few years that the US doesn't like cooperation. First, it was the Bush senior administration. Well, that was Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, the neocons of the day. And they basically didn't want to lift one finger to help the transformation of Russia into a new independent state that was peacefully integrated with its neighbors. Of course, they told lies. Gorbachev unilaterally said that he would disband the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. and James Baker III, our Secretary of State at the time, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, ran to Gorbachev. If you do this, we will absolutely not take advantage of the Soviet Union. We will absolutely not move NATO into where the Warsaw Pact is right now. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And there's a massive, wonderful archive of material with this promise repeated many times to Gorbachev by the Germans, by the US, by the Secretary General of NATO himself to a visiting Russian delegation. Well, turned out all to be lies, because as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved at the end of 1991, the neocons started planning the expansion of NATO, because they couldn't take yes for an answer that we should just have peace and cooperation. They needed the expansion. And who championed the expansion? Of course, the military-industrial complex led the lobbying. And it's not even subtle. The Raytheon top lobbyist was the head of the committee for the expansion of NATO. Well, duh, this was money. We can sell weapons. We can expand our military bases. We can expand our military budget. And of course, these neocons had the idea that they would make several wars of choice. They actually decided that already in the 1990s, that there would be several wars of choice, because there was no one to oppose it. So the US could depose all of the governments that were still aligned with Russia. That means the Syrian government, the Libyan government, the Saddam Hussein, and so forth. And they would find whatever excuse, whatever lies, whatever alleged provocations to launch wars of choice. And of course, we know that this happened. But the real origin of the Ukraine war was this relentless NATO march eastward, despite the core promises that were made and the core common sense, by the way, not just the promises. Why provoke Russia? And when Clinton actually started the machinery of NATO enlargement, his own Secretary of Defense, William Perry, thought about resigning in protest because he thought it was such a terrible idea that this would just lead to a new Cold War, just at the time that relations were being normalized. And our top diplomats knew this. They understood this. Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, said, don't expand NATO. You said no, and it's only going to provoke. Excuse me. Oh, God, I get choked up over this. George Kennan, our top historian diplomat, the person who invented containment, that concept of the 1940s, he never wanted to be militarized in this way. And he absolutely said, this is the biggest mistake imaginable to start expanding NATO. Well, I watched a lot of this pretty close up. Clinton, kind of as usual, not thinking very much, very short-term thinking, started the NATO expansion in the 1990s. That was to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. The Russians were very unhappy, but it wasn't a big crisis. It wasn't on their border. Then Bush Jr. comes in, all the wars of choice. And not to mention, by the way, in 1999, Clinton bombs, and not Clinton only, NATO bombs Belgrade for 6 straight weeks. Not exactly to Russia's liking, absolutely horrible. And that worsened the relations further. Then in 2002, the neocons under Bush Jr. called for the unilateral US withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Unbelievable. the Russians said, stop, don't do this. This puts us in a threat. This destabilizes the nuclear deterrence, which is our basis for just peacefully being able to trust each other and keeping on a path of denuclearization. Well, the US unilaterally withdraws and starts planning for placing missiles near Russia. And the Aegis missiles go into Poland and Romania within the next decade. Well, the Russians are really getting pretty upset about this. And then George W. expands NATO to 7 more countries in 2007. The 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And Putin goes to the Munich Security Summit in 2007 and says, come on, stop. You promised not 1 inch eastward, and now it's 10 countries you've expanded to. So the US, in its infinite wisdom as usual, what does it do? The next year, George W. Bush Jr., with, by the way, our US ambassador to NATO, Victoria Nuland. I hope that name rings a bell. She's currently our Deputy Secretary of State. They call for NATO to enlarge further. And where? To the 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, Ukraine, and to Georgia. Georgia, not the state, Georgia, the country, on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Look at a map, it ain't a North Atlantic country. But what it is a plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because the idea was, and it was a very premeditated US idea, that with NATO enlargement, NATO would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And notably, Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. And that was the idea. That, by the way, was the same idea of Lord Palmerston in 1853. So it's not a very original idea. It was the whole basis of the first Crimean War. And so these neocons wanted to fight the second Crimean War. And of course, you could hear the cheers of Britain, which is imperialist nostalgia to the essence in its political class. Yes, yes, yes. We can surround Russia in the Black Sea, just like Lord Palmerston wanted to do a century and a half earlier. Well, Putin says, do not do this. This could be incredibly destabilizing. But by the way, it wasn't just Putin who sent a secret memo back from Moscow to Washington to Condoleezza Rice. Well, of course, none other than Bill Burns. Bill Burns was then the US ambassador to Russia. But you may recall the name. He's currently our CIA director. And he sent a secret memo, because everything in the US government is secret, by the way. He sent a secret memo entitled Niet means Niet. And he explained something so basic, so obvious, that for Russia, this is a absolute hardcore bright red line. Do not go to Ukraine. And that it's not just Putin, it's the entire Russian society. They don't want the US military bases. They don't want Aegis missiles. They do not want to be crowded on their border by the US military. And it makes perfect sense, because we wouldn't like it either. But, you know, American security state leaders who don't ask us Americans, they're a little hard of hearing. So, did you say red line? We didn't hear that. So, of course, Bush pushes through the commitment by NATO to expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. I know European leaders told me in 2008, what is your president doing? But Europe, they're, I don't get it exactly, but they will not oppose the US in public. So they complained to me, but then they, in the end, signed on to Bush's crazy idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. Now, there was one last safety valve to understand in this, and that is the Ukrainians did not want this. Ukraine is a divided society, ethnically Ukrainian, ethnically Russian. They didn't want this crowding. They knew that this would destabilize the situation. So the elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, we will be neutral. We will not alarm Russia. Also, we'll extend a lease in Crimea for the Sevastopol naval fleet until 2042. We want quiet. The United States neocons don't like quiet. They want just to get their way. So in the end of 2013, they helped stoke first protests against Yanukovych, and then the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. And we know that Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden all played a role in the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian president. That's just a fact. Now, so much is hidden from view that we don't know exactly time and date, but the Russians intercepted one of Victoria Nuland's phone calls and posted it on YouTube so everybody can listen to it, as she and the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, plot the next post-Yanukovych government several weeks before a violent storming of the government buildings in Kiev. That's what happened. That's when the war started. We overthrew the government that wanted stability. And in came a series of governments that were Russophobic and pro-NATO and at the American service. And Obama and Trump and Biden pumped in arms. Now, just to finalize how we came to this current utter tragedy and disaster. When Biden came in, I had hopes, okay, maybe something rational. No way. Biden doubled down on Ukraine becoming a NATO member, doubled down repeatedly in 2021, said NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And on December 17th, 2021, Putin, really at wit's end, because he could not get the US to engage in diplomacy, put on the table, and you can find it on the internet, a draft US-Russia security agreement to avert a war. And at the time, the security agreement said, don't expand NATO, don't put your missiles close to our borders, and implement the Minsk II agreement, which is a United Nations Security Council-backed agreement for autonomy of the Russian-speaking regions in the east of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian nationalists blew off, and the United States said, yeah, don't worry about it. You don't have to follow through on a UN Security Council agreement. And Putin said, honor that agreement. Well, the basic story is, of course, the US refused to negotiate on these points. And on February 21st, 2022, there was a Russian Security Council meeting. You can find the minutes online again in the Russian government in English transcription or translation. President Putin calls on the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, give us a report on your diplomatic initiatives in regard to our security. And Lavrov says, the United States has formally notified us that the NATO enlargement issue is non-negotiable, that it's none of our business. That was the final step before the Russian invasion on February 24th. We rejected every single diplomatic chance to avoid a war. And we thought, okay, our wonderful weapons and our financial sanctions will do Russia in. And by the way, you know, I've been observing these kinds of things for 40 years. I wrote an article, it was, I think in June actually, so it was a couple months after this, saying that these neocon ploys are doomed to fail. The sanctions aren't going to kill the Russian economy. The wonder weapons are not going to defeat Russia and so forth. So obvious if you've seen this particular show repeatedly, as we have, all the promises of our generals and the military industrial complex and all the rest, wrong again and again and again. But what we did do was trap Ukraine in a devastating war between the US and Russia. So we provide the weapons, we provide, and I'll put it in quotation marks, the intelligence, because it's not very intelligent intelligence. And we tell them, run to the front lines. And tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died just in recent weeks because of this. An absolutely predictable bloodbath. And when the Ukrainians tried to negotiate with the Russians in March 2022, just after the start of the invasion, the US stopped the negotiations. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, said last fall, you know, maybe this is the time to negotiate, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who steps up? Secretary Nuland, the endless neocon. Doesn't matter whether she's working for Cheney, whether she's working for Hillary, whether she's working for Biden, she's the perpetual neocon. She says, no, the time's not right for negotiations. What is the subtext of that? Well, a lot more Ukrainians have to die. And that's where we are right now. And this administration doesn't know what to do because all its great plans backfired, but Biden doesn't want to look weak. He's, you know, facing an election next year. So as usual, they just tell the Ukrainians, just keep running into the Russian lines. Just keep dying. It is the cliche, fight to the last Ukrainian. And we even have senators like Romney say, you know, this is great. What's the problem? No Americans are dying. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what Romney says and what a lot of American leaders are saying. Yeah, we could put in $100 billion. What is that among friends in the military industrial complex? Of course, it means a lot to Americans who might care about their sustenance. But what they really think is, yeah, if the Ukrainians are ready to die for this, it weakens Russia and so forth. And that's where we are till now. So my conclusion, we could have avoided this war entirely. We could have avoided loss of territory. We could have avoided everything because there was no demand for any of this until the US pushed and pushed and pushed and is tone deaf, can't hear anyone else, doesn't believe anyone has red lines except the United States, and is on the path to do the same thing with Taiwan right now. And that's the war talk. So we're not out of this by any means. We're still in the midst of this neocon-dominated American foreign policy. It's what Kissinger famously said, to be a foe of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. So we embrace our friends like Ukraine to the point of their destruction. And now we're angling or threatening or escalating in our tensions with China for a war over Taiwan. Unbelievable. I was just in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago. What a wonderful and beautiful place, and very successful. And we are stoking a crisis by feeding it with armaments. So sorry to have talked so long, but thank you for being the voices for peace and sanity and rationality in this country. Biden's asked for another 20 plus billion. This is our moment to say, stop it already. Your reelection actually, Mr. Biden, doesn't count compared to the lives you are wasting, the tens of thousands who will die because you don't want an embarrassment on your watch. It's not going to help your campaign to be in a war next year. Nobody wants this in the United States. We don't like this. This is dangerous. This is unnecessary. We don't support you, Mr. President, in this. So stop now. It'll be a lot worse in your campaign. The whole concept that you have to look tough and strong for your 2024 reelection is a nonsense, and it's profoundly immoral. So we need to raise our voice now. I think more and more congressmen and senators are getting the idea that while they don't ask us our opinions in the United States about these issues, because it's not really about what Americans think, it's about what the military-industrial complex demands. We don't like it one bit. Actively left behind this progress that are really struggling for a variety of reasons. People live in more remote areas or in very unfavorable geographies, or are part of minority groups that have been maltreated within societies, or half the population, women and girls that traditionally were not part of the market economy, were part of the household economy, and have definitely seen progress, but facing a lot of social obstacles still today, which is why one of the Sustainable Development Goals is directed specifically at the issues of gender, SDG 5. So one of the three huge challenges is that we have a rich world and a lot of very poor and suffering people within that world. And that's just, I think for most of us, humanly unacceptable. And indeed, when the UN was established in 1948, all of the member states agreed that there should be basic standards of life for every person on the planet, because they're people on the planet, because they're human beings, and the world is productive enough to ensure the dignity of everybody. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I regard us still trying to honor that declaration, which seems to me to be the basic point. So problem number one is the very uneven development, the fact that there is still today a significant part of the world that lives in really abject deprivation. And that's a first challenge. And I think it's ethically probably the number one challenge, because extreme deprivation in a world of plenty is absolutely destructive of all of our humanity if we don't solve that problem. So that's why SDG 1 is end extreme poverty. Straightforward. And SDG 2, the second highest priority, is end hunger, for heaven's sake. Of course, there are big challenges of how to do it, but I will say in a world of wealth and knowledge, this is definitely within reach. It's crazy, to my mind, that if the average income is $12,000 per capita, there are people living at a few $100s per capita, and the world just goes on as they suffer and die young and face terrible hardships. The second big challenge, the huge challenge, the puzzle that is even harder than the first one conceptually, is that we discovered about 50 years ago that the nature of our economic development, all that wealth that I just talked about, is environmentally destructive, because the much vaunted economic processes don't take care of their physical byproducts. And some of them were not understood till 50 or 100 years ago, like greenhouse gases and their effects on climate. That required a scientific breakthrough of a quite deep order to understand that. It came by the end of the 19th century, and then it took at least 75 years to create measurement systems to verify the science. And we've more or less known from around 1980 that humanity is really changing the climate in ways that could be dangerous. And we're still struggling with that fact, because what brought us that wealth in the first place, starting in the 1800s, was fossil fuels. And then we discovered about halfway through, oh, those are dangerous. That's not good. So this is the second big problem, is that we have an economic system and a set of laws, rules, regulations, a global commons, the open seas, and many other factors of our economic system that mean that the scale of production is now self-destructive. And as I say, we've understood this intellectually at least for about 50 years. It was 50 years ago that the first conference on this fact took hold. It was 51 years ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases, not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things.
rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed, or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things, or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward perhaps to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic, environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right, and there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time, but there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business. It's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day. But we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals, because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems, really. It's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals. Maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success. Maybe, like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy, but China was concerned, the
the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. Still, without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%, and were able to conquer, therefore, 2 continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest is fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the 2 Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country, and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1800 years roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world, the North Atlantic region, would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire, and with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms, but not surprising because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are 2 significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know no history at all, I'm sorry to say. We're doing our best as teachers, but we're not doing very well. So the idea that what's happened in China is a return to normal is ununderstandable. And this is why there's so much tension right now. So it's very serious. And the tension came when China declared in the Made in China 2025 program, we will become key leaders of leading technologies. That was the biggest affront to the Americans. I say, bravo, go for it. This is good for the world. Technological advance anywhere lifts everyone, by the way, as long as it's not militarized and leads to destruction, but as long as it's used for human well-being. And by the way, Chinese technologies are already core to saving the world, whether it's medicines like artemisinin or whether it's the lowest cost solar production, solar modules. This is Chinese technology and we need it. It's going to be critical for world well-being. But one thing is the tension coming with China's recovery. We need dialogue on this to understand it. So that's one part. Second is that as the whole world economy has grown roughly 100 times since James Watt's steam engine, I would say realistically maybe 250 times since James Watt's steam engine, we're wrecking the natural environment. We really are. It's extremely serious. It's very late in the day. And so we need a common understanding of how we're going to get our own now globally shared technologies under control. So that is why I'm so happy to be here. I do think we're going to figure this out. But the strangest part of globalization is how little global dialogue there is. It's the paradox. It's so easy to have connection. You can get on a Zoom with anybody, but it's a big event if an American official talks to a Chinese official. It should be happening dozens of times a day, not top news. And I keep offering to President Biden, I'll give you a Zoom link. You can call President Putin and make peace. Or a phone number. I'll lend you my cell phone. Make a call. But here we are completely interconnected, but we don't talk with each other. And the specialty of the church is talking with each other. So here we are. Thank you very much.
Quality of political leadership is extremely low. Our president is 81 years old and should be in retirement. This is absolutely obvious. Our Congress is quite corrupt in the United States because we have a system of campaign financing that depends on billions and billions of dollars going from big companies to the congressmen and senators. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. There's a great deal of instability, and our political leaders don't know how to get along with each other. So you add this all up, it's definitely bad. Whether it's absolutely the worst, it's a little hard to judge, but it's bad enough that we ought to do something about it.
You actually mentioned many questions that I was going to ask, but if I understand correctly, how did we get there actually? So definitely there is some kind of crisis of leadership, because I believe that the problem is not only a senior American president, these problems can be also in other countries. Then, of course, there's a concentration of unprecedented crises. And of course, there is a part, I would say, that's considering the decisions that the superpowers make. Would you agree with this combination?
I think if I could put one word on the reason we're in this crisis, it is arrogance. Arrogance of the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the richest and the most powerful of all during this period. So the arrogance of the United States has been extremely notable. You know, when the Cold War ended in 1989 in Central Europe and in 1991 in the former Soviet Union, we might have said, now we have a glorious opportunity for peace, for cooperation, and for prosperity. This didn't happen. It could have happened. I was there. I saw what could have been done. Instead, the United States said, we won, we're the best, we're the most powerful, we don't have to deal with anybody except on our own terms. And the United States absolutely went from arrogant to hyper arrogant and said, we can do what we want, where we want. And strangely enough, though the United States basically faced no security threats after that time, it went to war more often than ever. Of course, it completely misjudged two things. One, it continued to think of Russia as a natural enemy, and so it actually created a new enemy, because I was advisor to Gorbachev, I was advisor to Yeltsin. They wanted absolute peace and normal relations. There's no doubt in my mind. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a plot. It was an attempt to create normal relations. The United States instead said, oh, no, we won. Now we'll move NATO. Okay, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland. Oh, we'll keep moving. We'll go to the Baltics. We'll go to Romania, Bulgaria. We'll go to the Balkans. Oh, no. We'll go to Ukraine. We'll go to Georgia. We'll surround Russia. We'll decolonize Russia. That's a term used in American political circles. Even saying, oh, Russia should be dismembered now. Well, what on earth are these people thinking? Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, a powerful army, a self-respect, and a desire for its own security. And so the United States provoked what absolutely it should not have provoked. So this was a part of the issue. A second part of the issue is that, in general, the rich became arrogant in a different way, saying, oh, we're so good. We used to be millionaires. Now we're billionaires. We don't have to share anything. So they became libertarian in philosophy. Libertarian in American philosophy means we don't have to pay taxes because what we have is ours and nobody's going to take it away. And so we developed a super rich class that became very self-righteous. That's my money. It's nobody else's money. How dare the government think to take it? And at the same time, a growing amount of people struggling in poverty or losing jobs to technology, being replaced by robots, being replaced by automation. So the gap in our society between the rich and the poor widened considerably. And this was the second factor. And you would think that in a political democracy, the poor people would vote out the ones that are leaning on them, or would vote for tax increases on the small group of very powerful. But that theory is wrong, because the small group of very powerful buy the politicians. They really do. And so they pay the campaign contributions. And the first rule of the US Congress is vote tax cuts for companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades. Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, that would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year. Probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society. Some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate. And I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy. and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington." And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach.
New money. So as the old debt was coming due, a government would normally borrow new money to pay off the old money and keep the debt level pretty much the same. But Argentina has no friends. Nobody trusts it. So as the Argentine debt was coming due, everyone wanted to be repaid. Thank you. No more loans. So I was trying to help, since part of my work over the last 40 years has been in economic emergencies, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with their bank creditors, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. And I said, oh God, this is tough. Nobody believes in Argentina, least of all the Argentines. So after these agreements were reached, I flew to Buenos Aires and I met in a large room with Argentina's PUBAs, the powers and shakers. And I said, you know, your situation is not as bad as you think. Your debt is actually not so high. Your need for the central bank to print money is actually not so high. It's just that nobody trusts you. So if we could regain trust, believe me, you know, your balance sheet is actually better than the US government. It's just that in the US, everybody uses the dollar, so you could run big budget deficits. But Argentina's budget deficit was smaller than the US, and Argentina's inflation soared because everyone was always ready to run out of the peso. Okay, so I said, just rebuild trust. I felt pretty good. Compelling speech, showed the data, showed that the US is worse at a fundamental level than Argentina. Flew home, and within days, the finance minister basically resigned because his own political party more or less disowned him after he had gotten these agreements. Oh my God, okay, he's gone. Inflation soars again. And so all that handiwork of saying, you know, there's a way to get out of this, be careful, evaporated, and the inflation eventually rose to more than 100% per year, which is pretty high, although I've dealt with countries in thousands of percent per year. But it was sufficiently high that the Argentines said in this election, we don't want to hear anything about any standard politician. We want something completely new. And the incoming president promised something completely new, specifically to adopt the dollar. And it's probably not going to happen because quickly they backtrack. We don't even have dollars. We can't tie our future to a currency in which we have no reserves. We couldn't back the banking system and so forth. I've not spoken with the new government, although I know the incoming finance minister quite well. I plan to speak with them. The long and the short of it is, this is just chronic crisis. So I wouldn't draw too much about general facts from Argentina, because basically almost any time between 1823 and 2023, you could have found the country in crisis. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina. And they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing and an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist, so on the American side of this bloc politics. My message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the US in this sense. Trade with the US, trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the US is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is, you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE, and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia... I
didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting
it's very
part.
interesting. It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook the hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that, you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western-based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle, is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices, or at international prices, larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken US policies on the dollar. So the US has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the US a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina, where everyone's sitting on the edge as the US debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the US being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege, that you get to borrow, you can pump up the money supply, you get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the US just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The US generally is addicted to regime change. The US generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the US figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars, thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in US banks or US controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the US has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the US influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserves? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the US banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi. We could trade with India and rupees, a little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year, Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy, the ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, And so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926 that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport. He had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical. And we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson.